Adise was 16, with wide, curious eyes that often reflected the intensity of her thoughts. She was the kind of girl who could sit under the shade of a tree for hours, deeply immersed in a book or the scent of the earth after a rainstorm. She had always been fascinated by the world around her, particularly the forest, where her mother, Miriam, taught her the secrets of nature. Adise's mother was a gifted herbalist, known far and wide for her healing skills. Her hands could turn any leaf, root, or bark into a remedy for ailments, from the common cold to more severe, life-threatening illnesses. Adise had spent her childhood following her mother through the forests, memorizing the names of the plants and learning how to create the potions and balms that soothed her neighbors. The forest was where Adise found peace, where she could escape from the noise of the world and focus on something beautiful and pure. It was where she felt closest to her mother, whose wisdom was boundless. But one fateful day, that peace was shattered forever. Miriam fell ill. It was sudden. No one expected it. One minute, she was out gathering herbs with Adise, and the next, she was racked with a fever that no one could explain. The village healer, who was called in immediately, said it was a fever, but Adise couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her mother had always been strong, never ill for long. The fever consumed her quickly, and within days, Miriam was gone. The villagers murmured that it was simply a fever, that such things happened. But Adise didn't believe it. Her mother had always been healthy, always strong. There was no warning, no sign that she was in any danger. Adise couldn't escape the nagging feeling that her stepfather, Okafor, might have had something to do with it. He had always been a man of dark moods, prone to bursts of anger, and he'd grown colder in the days leading up to Miriam's death. Adise could never prove it, though her suspicions remained just that, suspicions. Okafor was a respected man in the village, known for his wealth and influence, and no one questioned him. After her mother's death, things began to change in the house. Okafor's behavior, which had always been difficult, became crueler. At first, it was subtle, a harsh word here, a cold glance there. But soon, it escalated. Adise could never do anything right in Okafor's eyes. If she made the smallest mistake, he would scold her mercilessly. If she didn't do something exactly how he wanted, she'd pay for it. It started with small slaps, pushing her out of the way when she was in his path, or yelling at her for no reason at all. But over time, the abuse became more intense. Okafor had become a man of two faces. In public, he was kind, gentle, and respected. But in private, he was a monster, lashing out at Adise for the slightest offenses. She could never understand why. She had been nothing but good to him, respectful, obedient, but nothing seemed to appease him. The village turned a blind eye. Okafor spun a story that Adise was simply mad with grief, that the loss of her mother had driven her to madness. He claimed that she would injure herself in fits of hysteria. The villagers, hesitant to question Okafor's authority, believed him. After all, he had always been a man of stature in the village, a man who had helped build the community. Who could possibly think ill of him? And so, Adise suffered in silence, her pain invisible to the outside world, hidden behind her quiet demeanor. The first brutal incident that marked the turning point came late one night. It had been a long, tiring day. Adise had been working on preparing some herbs when Okafor demanded palm wine. She was exhausted, and it was already late, but she still went to fetch it. When she returned, he was already angry. He had been drinking, and his words slurred. "You took too long," he snapped. "I shouldn't have to wait on you." She tried to explain, but he didn't want to hear it. In an instant, he grabbed her arm and dragged her out of the house. His grip was like iron as he yanked her toward the yard. Adise struggled, but he was too strong. She was powerless to resist. "You think you can disobey me?" he shouted, his face twisted with rage. Then he kicked her. Over and over again, his boots landing on her legs with sickening force. Adise's world spun as she hit the ground. The pain was unbearable. She screamed out, but no one came. No one dared to interfere. Okafor's fury raged unchecked as he kicked her again and again. Finally, when he was done, he left her there, broken and bleeding. She crawled across the ground, her legs useless, her body racked with pain. Every movement felt like fire. She lay on the floor, the dirt clinging to her skin, and whispered through clenched teeth, "One day, I'll walk again, and he will crawl for mercy." The promise burned in her chest like a fire. Though her body ached, her spirit had not been broken. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the fire that had ignited inside her. She would rise again. And when she did, she would make Okafor pay. The days that followed were a blur of pain and numbness. Adise faded in and out of consciousness, her body refusing to obey the most basic commands. She had been found just before dawn by a woman fetching water, one of the few in the village who still remembered her mother's kindness. The woman had run to fetch Izioma, the elderly healer who lived near the western edge of the village. Izioma was no longer as sharp as Adise's mother had been, but her hands were still steady and her heart still willing. Izioma set Adise's legs in tight wrappings made of bamboo splints and soft cloth soaked in soothing leaves. She murmured chants while applying warm poultices to Adise's knees and ankles. But her face was grave. She said little, only that time would tell how much of Adise's strength would return. The healing was slow and incomplete. Her legs became weaker, and the right one never truly straightened again. Every step was a war between determination and pain. Some mornings, her limbs refused her altogether. She would crawl across the floor with shaking arms, every movement a humiliation that burned like fire under her skin. Still, she endured. Okafor never apologized. In fact, he mocked her. He called her Nwani Ahoyua, cursed girl, every time she limped past. He kicked her bowl away when she crawled to eat and laughed as she scrambled to pick up fallen pieces. Even goats walk better than you, he sneered one evening, drunk and waving his hand as if swatting a fly. The villagers, seeing her in the compound or at the stream, no longer saw a once promising herbalist's daughter. They saw only a broken girl with a twisted leg and haunted eyes. They shook their heads with pity, offered her scraps of food and muttered prayers under their breath, but never once challenged Okafor. Fear held them like chains. Okafor was too powerful. Too respected. Too cruel. So Adise endured in silence. But inside her, something began to stir. It started with dreams. At first, they came like whispers. A soft hum in her ear. A breeze that seemed to carry her mother's voice, calling her name from deep within the forest. Then came the visions, vivid and strange. She saw her mother's hands tying herbs into bundles, heard her voice reciting chants and instructions, felt the roughness of tree bark beneath her fingers. The dreams always ended the same way, with her mother standing by the edge of the forest, pointing inward, her eyes fierce and full of purpose. "Finish what I started, Adise," her mother's voice would say. The forest still remembers. The dreams shook her. They felt more real than waking. And one morning, before the sun rose, Adise dragged herself out of the compound. Every muscle in her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. She used her hands to crawl, pulling herself through the early morning mist. The forest lay only a short distance from the village, but for her, it felt like crossing continents. When she reached the edge, the familiar scent of damp earth and wild blossoms wrapped around her like an embrace. She hadn't returned since her mother's death. Tears filled her eyes. She whispered, "I'm back, Mama," and the wind stirred in reply. She found the hidden spot where her mother once kept her collection of dried herbs and notes, tucked away in a hollow tree behind a cluster of moss-covered stones. The papers were yellowed, some torn, but most were intact. Carefully, Adise began to read, her fingers trembling with the weight of memory. From that day on, she returned to the forest whenever she could. At dawn, while Okafor still snored, she would drag herself past the compound wall and disappear into the trees. She moved slowly, leaning on whatever sticks she could find, practicing the recipes and rituals her mother had written down. She began collecting herbs again, wrapping them in cloth and hiding them under her mat. Her fingers regained their grace, even if her legs did not. The forest became her refuge, her silent ally, her teacher. It was during one of these early morning journeys that she met Nana. He was a beggar who sat near the market square with a twisted leg and a sharp tongue. Most villagers ignored him, dropping coins into his calabash out of habit, never truly seeing him. But he noticed Adiz immediately. He saw the stiffness in her movement, the pain in her eyes, and the fire that hadn't been extinguished. "You walk like the gods are trying to pull you back to the earth," he said one morning, smirking as she limped past. She turned to him, surprised. "And you sit like they already have." He barked out a laugh, a loud, dry sound that echoed against the walls. "Touché," he said. "But at least you still move. That means something." He became her friend, quietly, without ceremony. Nana had once been a hunter, or so he claimed, before a fall from a cliff shattered his leg. The village had no use for broken men, so he had learned to survive on pity and wit. But he still remembered things. He taught Adiz how to shift her weight to reduce strain on her knees. How to lean with strength, not desperation. "Pain is a teacher," he told her. "It will either train you, or break you. Choose." Adiz listened. She practiced. And slowly, she learned to move with pain, not in spite of it. Her steps were not graceful, but they were steady. With time, she began to crave more than borrowed sticks and broken branches for support. She wanted something of her own, something sacred. So she carved herself a staff from the trunk of an Irako sapling in the forest. Every groove she etched into it carried a memory, the spiral of a healing vine her mother once used for childbirth, the curve of a fern that soothed fever, the symbol from her mother's calabash that meant life after sorrow. She named the staff Odiu, a word her mother used for beginnings. It became more than a walking stick. It became an extension of her will. With Odiu in hand, she no longer looked like a broken girl dragging herself across the earth. She looked like someone rising from it. The villagers still stared. Okafor still mocked. But Adiz walked through them now, not fast, not without pain, but with the certainty of someone who had found purpose through suffering. Inside her, the fire burned brighter. The forest had accepted her again. The wind carried her mother's voice. Nana's lessons guided her steps. And in her hand, Odiu reminded her every day that she was not finished. The mornings still arrived in silence, and Adiz still limped into the forest before the sun knew her name. But now, she returned with more than herbs, she came back with answers. She had mastered remedies for burns and fevers, for swelling and strange dreams. Her mother's old notes had become more than a guide, they had become scripture. It started with children. One evening, as she rested by the forest's edge, a woman approached her. Not a stranger, but someone Adiz remembered crying at her mother's burial. The woman's toddler had a persistent cough, and the village healer's powders were doing nothing. With trembling hands, the woman said, "I have nothing but this yam. Please, help my son." Adiz didn't hesitate. She crushed leaves, boiled a root with a pinch of bark, whispered a blessing her mother once taught her, and sent the woman home. 2 nights later, the child slept soundly, no more coughing. Word spread slowly, like an ember dancing in dried grass. Soon, others came. Not publicly. Never loudly. But one by one, the mothers of the village began to knock softly on the outer wall of Adiz's compound just before dawn. She would hobble to the side, take their empty gourds, and fill them with mixtures she'd prepared overnight. Boiled leaves for colic. Fermented seeds for fever. Ground bark for rashes. They never stayed long. Always, they left with eyes full of guilt and hope. Okafor noticed. He was not a fool, only drunk with control. He watched the women from a distance, his lips tight with suspicion. One evening, he confronted Adiz, his breath thick with palm wine. "You think you are your mother?" he snarled. "You think I don't see what you do in the shadows?" She said nothing. She knew better than to provoke him then. But the next morning, he locked the gate and took the key. "No more forest," he declared. "You belong here." For days, she was trapped. The forest, her teacher, was just beyond the wall, but out of reach. Still, she was no longer powerless. She had tried enough herbs to last weeks. Her hands still knew what to do. And when she closed her eyes, the forest came to her. It happened on a night when the moon was hidden and the world was dark. Adise lay on her mat, whispering her mother's chants under her breath. Suddenly, a wind howled through the cracks in the roof. Cold and fierce. Her staff, Obio, rattled where it stood against the wall. Then, silence. And then, light. She blinked. In the middle of the room stood her mother, bathed in a soft flame, her eyes endless. In her hands, she held a small clay bowl. Inside it, herbs burned with a pale blue fire. The scent was familiar: leaves used for protection, roots for truth, ash from sacred bark. Her mother spoke, "When fire meets root, only truth survives. Let justice walk with you." She handed Adise the bowl. And then she was gone. Adise awoke with tears streaming down her face, and her hands smelled of burnt leaves. That morning, she broke out. Using a rusted spoon and sheer will, she dug under the fence. Inch by inch, she carved space until she could squeeze through. Her body screamed in pain, but her spirit was louder. She returned to the forest, and this time, she carried the fire with her. Not long after, the village was shaken. A boy named Ifechi was bitten by a bush viper. His legs swelled with poison, his body burning with fever. The village healer, now aging and forgetful, offered him water and bark, but nothing worked. His mother, desperate and weeping, came to Adise. She didn't ask. She only said, "If he dies, my world dies." Adise took a breath and went with her. The village gathered. They watched as Adise approached the boy, her limp slow and pronounced, her eyes sharp with knowledge. The healer tried to stop her, but Adise raised her staff and said, "If he dies while you wait, will you blame fear or pride?" There was silence. She knelt beside the boy. She made a poultice from ground herbs and chewed leaves, placing them directly over the wound. She boiled water and made the child drink slowly. She sang an old chant to calm his heartbeat. She stayed through the night, changing the dressing every few hours. By morning, the swelling had gone down. The boy opened his eyes. Gasps of wonder rippled through the crowd. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap. But they looked at her differently. Even the healer, his pride bruised, bowed his head in grudging respect. But not Okafor. When he heard the story, his fury rose like a tidal wave. That night, he stumbled into the compound, reeking of palm wine, dragging out a small chest, the old herbal box that once belonged to Adise's mother. He doused it with palm oil and reached for a torch. "Let's see how strong you are without your dead witch's tricks," he shouted. Adise stood between him and the flames. "No," she said. He raised the torch higher. "I made you crawl. I can make you crawl again." She raised her staff. "Try." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't blink. She stared into him as if peeling back his skin and exposing what lay beneath: fear. She didn't strike him. She didn't scream. She only looked. And in that silence, Okafor faltered. "Your fire can't burn her spirit," she whispered. "You killed her body. But you made me." He dropped the torch. Not because he was convinced, but because for the first time, something in her eyes terrified him. She was not the broken girl he used to beat. She was someone rising. That night, he said nothing more. And Adise, hands trembling, hid her mother's box beneath her mat and stayed up until dawn, whispering chants to the fire in her heart. The village didn't speak openly of what happened. But whispers grew. Stories slipped between walls and rested in ears. Adise was no longer just the girl who limped. She was the girl who healed. The girl who dared. The girl who stared down a monster. And the wind in the forest carried her name like a promise. She no longer flinched at her own shadow. Each morning, Adise rose before the cock's crow, gripped her staff Obio, and walked the path to the forest not as a girl in pain, but as a woman carved by fire. Her limp still echoed through her stride, but now, it was more like thunder than weakness. The children began to call her the limping lioness, and the name traveled fast. Her walk was no longer hidden. The women no longer whispered. They brought their sick openly. Men watched from the corners, still too proud to step forward, but no longer mocking. Even the market women began to make space for her, placing stools in the shade when they saw her approach. Some said she had power in her hands. Others swore they saw a spirit behind her when she walked. What they all agreed on was this: Adie's would not be broken again. And so, it was no surprise when a messenger from the palace arrived one dry morning, sweat pouring down his chest. The chief's wife was ill, struck with a fever that had lasted 10 nights. The village's healer had tried and failed. The chief himself, a man who barely nodded at Adie's during gatherings, now asked for her. She stared at the messenger for a long moment and then said, "I will go. But only if the chief gives me truth." He frowned. "You mean payment?" "No," she replied. "Truth. Let him prepare it." Word of her bold demand reached many ears before she even arrived at the palace. The chief sat in his large compound, waiting with silent shame in his eyes. Adie's entered calmly, her white wrap glistening against the red earth, Obio clicking softly with each step. She was taken to the wife, whose body was covered in cold sweat. Her breathing came in short gasps, and her lips were cracked. Adie's recognized the symptoms: malaria, worsened by age and poor treatment. She crushed neem leaves with a stone, mixed in bitter roots, and gave the woman a thick, dark paste to swallow. Then she turned to the chief. "I held my part of the bargain. Now you hold yours." The chief sighed. Age hung heavy on his shoulders, but it was guilt that weighed him down the most. He poured himself a cup of water, hands trembling slightly. "I knew about Okafor," he began. "Years ago. He beat his first wife, before your mother. The elders warned me not to get involved, that domestic matters are not for the chief." Adie's didn't blink. "I said nothing when he married your mother. I said nothing when she died. And when you started limping." I closed my eyes. Adie's stared at him until the silence grew thick. "Silence is guilt's servant," she said softly. "And now it stands beside you." The chief looked away. She rose and left without another word, but her point had been made. In the weeks that followed, the chief sent quiet support. Not gold or gifts, but protection. Adie's now moved freely. No one dared stop her. And in secret, she began a different kind of healing, one of truth. She spoke to 2 women who had once served in Okafor's household. One remembered bruises on her mistress's arms. Another spoke of late-night screams. A farmer confessed that he once saw Okafor beat Adie's near the yam barn but stayed silent because he was a respected man. Adie's wrote everything down. She didn't yet know how it would end, but she was no longer waiting for fate. Then came the final blow. It was market day when Okafor returned from a trip with a stranger, a wealthy old trader from a neighboring town. The man smiled greedily when he looked at Adie's. "She is strong," the man said. "Perfect for bearing sons. I'll give you 5 goats, 20 yams, and land near the river." Adie's froze. Okafor turned to her with mock kindness. "He is rich. You will live well. No more crawling in dirt." "I am not a goat to be traded," she whispered. Okafor's face twisted. "You forget who owns you." That night, when they returned home, Okafor dragged her by the hair into the center of the compound. The stars watched in silence as he struck her across the face and kicked her in the leg, again. The old injury screamed inside her bones. But this time, something didn't break. He waited for her to cry. To beg. But she didn't. She pulled herself to the wall and stood slowly, Obio clenched in her fingers. Her face bled, but her eyes burned like the same fire she'd seen in her vision. "I do not crawl for cowards," she said. Then, without another word, she went inside. At dawn, she emerged in a flowing white wrapper, the same one she wore when she healed the chief's wife. Her hair was braided back. Her face was calm. And her staff glowed with oil. She walked to the market square, Obio striking each step with purpose. By mid-morning, the entire village gathered to see her standing by the judgment stone. "I have walked with pain," she said. "But now, I walk for justice." Whispers circled. Eyes widened. Children stood on tiptoe to see. "My stepfather," she said, not shouting but with a voice that carried, "beat me when I was a girl. Broke my legs. Sold me like yam. He killed my mother, whether by hand or silence, I cannot prove. But I am here. I survived. And I will not let him rise without falling." Gasps echoed. Some elders shook their heads. Others nodded slowly. Okafor appeared at the edge of the square, mouth twitching in disbelief. "You lie." Adise raised her staff. "Then come stand before the judgment stone. Let the truth speak." And with that, the girl who once crawled in silence now stood with a village before her, her staff in her hand, and fire in her voice. The sun rose like a great golden drum in the sky, beating warmth over the hills and into the village of UCHE. It was the New Yam festival, the most celebrated day of the year, when harvest was honored and ancestors remembered. Stalls bustled with traders. Children wore new clothes. Drums boomed from the square, and the scent of roasted yams, palm oil, and fried plantains floated on the air. But beneath the excitement ran a quiet ripple. Everyone had heard that Adise, the limping lioness, would speak today. As the dancers swirled and the elders seated themselves in the sacred circle, a hush settled over the people. Then she came. Adise limped into the square like a storm entering sunlight. Her wrapper was white as bone, lined with the deep red of kola nut. Her braided hair gleamed with oil. Her staff, Obio, tapped against the earth in steady rhythm. Her eyes didn't search the crowd for sympathy, they searched it for truth. She was no longer the girl who crawled through the forest. She was the judge who walked on broken legs. People parted for her. Children held their mothers' hands tighter. Even the drummers slowed their rhythm. She stepped before the judgment stone, the tall slab of granite where generations had declared truth or disgrace. "I speak today," she said, her voice loud and clear, not for vengeance, but for balance. For every girl who has bled behind closed doors. For every woman whose silence was mistaken for weakness. For my mother, who died with secrets in her lungs. And for the child I used to be, whose legs were broken not by war, but by the man called father. A breath passed through the crowd like wind through leaves. Then laughter rang out, dry, sharp. It was Okafor. Dressed in his finest wrapper, arms folded, standing just beyond the circle of elders. "This again?" he called out, sneering. "More lies from a limping mad girl? Has the festival become a place for madness now?" Some elders shifted uncomfortably. Others stayed silent, watching. Adise raised her hand. "Let truth stand before you," she said, and unrolled a scroll made of old parchment and palm leaf notes. "I have here the stories of others who suffered under this man. Neka, who served as his house girl, beaten until her tooth cracked. Asanachi, his first wife, who fled with her child into the forest. Ebra, who saw him strike my mother days before she fell ill. And me." She paused. Then she lifted her wrapper gently, revealing old scars lining her legs like tree roots. Purple. Twisted. Proof that spoke louder than any drum. When I refused to fetch wine one night, he kicked me until my bones cracked. He left me crawling. And when I began to heal, he tried to sell me to an old trader for yams and goats. Silence swallowed the square. "Look at your daughters," she said to the crowd. "Would you trade their blood for land? Look at your sons. Would you let them become monsters behind closed doors?" There was no reply, just eyes wide with recognition. Whispers began like the rustling of dry leaves. "She speaks the truth. I saw her that night. Crawling. She healed my child. She saved my wife. I always feared him. The whispers grew louder until they became voices. Voices became cries. Some men called for Okafor to defend himself. Others shouted for the elders to speak. Okafor began to retreat, his sneer replaced by a snarl. Lies, he barked. Witchcraft and manipulation. She wants to shame me because I disciplined her. He turned to flee, but Adiz was ready. Earlier that morning, she had ground a special blend of herbs, taught to her in a dream by her mother, a rare mix that caused severe itching, dizziness, and waking nightmares if walked upon. She had scattered it in a tight circle near the judgment stone. The moment Okafor's feet hit the ground near that spot, he staggered. His face twisted. He scratched at his ankles. His eyes rolled back, seeing things only he could see. He clawed at his chest, stumbling. Then, he fell. Right in front of the entire village. He screamed, rolling in the dirt, trying to escape the madness crawling on his skin and through his brain. The once proud man, the feared father, the respected villager, lay collapsed like a broken calabash. Gasps filled the air. The village chief stood, regal in his red beads and white wrapper. He raised his hand, silencing the crowd. Okafor, he said, for years you wore a mask of dignity. But truth has stripped you bare. You are unfit for our circle. For our homes. You will be exiled, sent to the forest, as was done in the days of our ancestors. There, you will live alone. Let the trees judge you. Men came forward. Not guards, villagers. Fathers. Brothers. Husbands. They lifted Okafor like refuse, carrying him past the edge of the square, ignoring his pleas. His screams followed them until they vanished into the trees. Adiz remained standing. Calm. Steady. A young girl stepped forward. Then another. And another. They knelt before her. Then a woman did. Then a mother. Soon, the entire crowd bowed, not out of pity, but in reverence. And as they did, Adiz said one line, quiet but eternal. On these broken feet, I brought you to your knees. The drums returned, not in celebration, but in honor. Adiz turned from the judgment stone and walked, not away, but forward. Into a new day, a new name, and a story no one would ever dare silence again. The sky darkened slightly as Okafor was dragged out of the village square. His legs flailed, and his voice broke into curses that had no more power. Witch. Limping devil. I will return. You will pay. But his words fell like dry palm fronds in a storm, useless, ignored, forgotten. Two strong men hauled him through the bush path that led to the abandoned shrine of judgment, a crumbling, snake-infested place where cursed ones were once sent in the old days. His clothes snagged on thorns. His dignity bled away with each step. When they reached the stone gate, they tossed him in and walked away without looking back. The shrine swallowed him in shadow, and the silence that followed was louder than his screams. Back in the village, Adiz stood at the threshold of the house that had once caged her pain. The compound that had echoed with her cries, where Okafor's cruelty had fed on silence. Now, that silence was broken, not by screams, but by the steady footsteps of women. They came one by one, elderly, young, widowed, married, holding brooms, buckets of water, herbs, firewood, and salt. No words were spoken. They simply moved together with Adiz as she entered the room where she had once been dragged by her hair, kicked in the legs, mocked for her limp. Adiz poured palm oil onto the ground. Another woman added dried leaves. Another struck a match. The flames rose quickly. They stood there as smoke lifted memories into the sky. A few women cried, not just for Adiz, but for their own hidden stories, for the pain buried in silence. Adiz did not cry. She watched until only ashes remained. Then, with bare hands, she dug shallow furrows into the warm soil and planted the first healing herbs, bitterleaf for cleansing, uziza for protection, and agwundu, the herb of life. The next morning, she prepared a shrine. It was not large or made of gold, but it breathed with love. At the back of her mother's old hut, Adise arranged stones in a perfect circle. She crushed mint and lemongrass into a paste and smeared it on each stone. Then she placed dried medicinal roots in a clay pot, roots her mother had once used to treat fever and childbirth pains. At the center of the shrine, she poured cool water from her mother's calabash, the same one that had once soothed her wounds. She knelt and whispered, "Mama, your hands healed many. Your wisdom never died. It lives in me now." As if in answer, a soft wind passed through the leaves above, and the scent of mint danced in the air. The village took notice. First, it was the old widow whose knees swelled every harmattan. Adise boiled a leaf tonic for her, and the pain eased. Then came the boy with the cough that rattled like a gourd. Adise mixed crushed bark and honey, and he could breathe again. Soon, even the chief sent word, his newborn grandson had rashes all over his body. Adise arrived with her staff and her herbs. Within days, the rashes faded like old ink on cloth. The elders gathered, and this time, they didn't hesitate. In a public gathering under the ancient Iroko tree, they named her the village's official healer and spiritual guide. "Adise," said the chief, "your feet may have limped, but your spirit has marched stronger than any warrior. From this day, let no one call you crippled. Let no one call you girl. You are Nwani Ukwu, the woman who stood tall." The name echoed through the crowd. Nwani Ukwu. And Adise smiled, not for glory, but because her mother's voice whispered again, proud and full of peace. Children began to follow her, not just to fetch water or carry herbs, but to learn. She started with small lessons: how to recognize ojericide leaves, how to clean a wound without salt, how to crush scent leaf without losing its strength. Girls who had once hidden behind their mothers now stood beside Adise, repeating the names of herbs, asking questions, taking notes on scraps of old cloth. She told them, strength is not in how loud you shout, but in how deeply you heal. Some boys laughed at the girls learning healing. Adise simply said, mocking medicine is how a fool earns fever. The boys stopped laughing, and began learning too. One afternoon, a young girl named Chika asked her, "Will you teach us how to be brave like you?" Adise knelt beside her and replied, "I didn't learn bravery. I remembered it. It was always there." She taught them not just about herbs, but about standing firm. About listening to their inner voice. About not bowing to the shadows of others' power. The village transformed, slowly but surely. No longer did people whisper abuse and keep it locked behind doors. Wives began to speak. Daughters were listened to. Sons were taught not just to hunt or farm, but to feel and understand. And every evening, from the hill where her mother's shrine stood, the scent of crushed mint and healing smoke drifted over Yuman like a quiet blessing. In the shrine's firelight, her calabash glowed. In the compound's soil, new herbs bloomed where pain once lived. And in the heart of the village, a woman who once crawled now walked with a limp, but carried the world with her. Nwani Ukwu. The woman who stood tall. The years moved like shadows over Yuman, and the seasons grew wise with Adise. Now in her 20s, she walked not as the broken girl the village once pitied, but as a woman revered, her limp no longer a sign of weakness, but a testament to every pain she had conquered. She had grown tall, lean, and sharp-eyed, her skin the hue of roasted kola, her voice like smooth stone rolling over water. Children greeted her with songs, elders bowed their heads in greeting, and travelers came bearing sick relatives, hoping the famed Nwani Ukwu could do what even time could not. Despite the ache in her bones, she moved through the village like wind, quiet yet everywhere. Her staff, Odiu, had worn smooth from years of walking, but its carvings still gleamed. Her compound, once filled with ashes, now bloomed with medicinal plants from every corner of the forest. Her mother's shrine stood tall, vines curling gently around the stones as if the earth itself honored the woman who had birthed Adise's strength. Then one evening, as the sun prepared to kiss the horizon, a boy arrived. He was thin, dusty, no older than 10, with wild eyes and feet blistered from long travel. He stood at the edge of her garden, afraid to come closer until one of her apprentices brought him in. "What's your name, child?" Adise asked, kneeling before him. "Ikenna," he replied, voice cracking from thirst. She offered him water and peeled oranges. He gulped both quickly, then looked at her as if trying to believe she was real. I saw a man, he said. In the forest, near our village. He was mad, shouting your name. He kept saying Adis will come. Adis will come. Adis' hand froze around the calabash. What did he look like? Old. Dirty. His legs shake. His mouth bleeds when he talks. He calls the trees by your name. Her stomach twisted, not in fear, but in certainty. It was Okafor. That night, Adis could not sleep. The stars blinked above her like knowing eyes. Her dreams were restless flashes, her mother's hands, blood on the compound floor, a staff rising in fire. When the cock crowed, she rose before the others. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She dressed simply, wrapped her herbs in cloth, took her staff, and began the journey toward the distant forest. Her limp had not faded with time, but her steps were powerful, and she walked farther than most could run. The morning mist licked her feet. Birds paused in their song as she passed. The forest she entered was different from Yamun's green heart. Here, the trees were wilder, the roots tangled like old secrets, and the silence was heavy. She found him near a stream, curled under a fallen tree like a forgotten bag of bones. Okafor. He was thinner than a broom handle, skin stretched over bone, his beard tangled with leaves. He muttered nonsense, scratching the earth with his fingers. His clothes hung like shredded rags. When he heard her footsteps, his eyes snapped open. Ah! Adis, he shrieked, trying to crawl backward. You've come to burn me again. Witch. Spirit. Judge. She said nothing. He groaned and fell on his side. I'm sorry. I was strong once, they listened to me once. But now even the trees laugh when I sleep. She watched him carefully. He was no longer the monster from her childhood. No longer the man whose hands bruised her skin, whose voice bent her spine. He was dust now. A broken whisper of who he'd been. He looked up at her, and the fire in his eyes flickered out. I'm dying, he said quietly. The forest will take me soon. Forgive me. Adis knelt beside him. She placed her walking staff across her lap and let silence settle between them like thick rain. He cried. Tears rolled down his sunken cheeks. He tried to speak again, but his words came out in fragments, memories, regrets, apologies that tangled like weeds. Still, Adis said nothing. Her presence was enough. As he trembled, coughing blood into the soil, she watched, not with vengeance, but with calm knowing. This was his ending. No one had come to carry him. No one would dig his grave. When he finally exhaled his last breath, it was soft, barely a sound, like the last puff of wind before a calm. She did not close his eyes. She stood and turned away. Behind her, the forest whispered and carried him into its belly, body and bones swallowed by vines, insects, and soil. No stone would mark him. No name would be spoken in honor. He belonged to the silence now. On her walk back, Adis did not limp out of pain, but out of rhythm. Her steps struck the ground like heartbeats. Birds scattered from the trees. Leaves trembled as she passed. The forest, which had once hidden both her trauma and her training, now watched her return like a queen to her throne. At the edge of her village, a child pointed and gasped, "It's her." Women stopped pounding yam. Men paused their fishing nets. Children raced to meet her. She said nothing. She simply walked past them, robes fluttering, staff steady. Her steps thundered in the earth, not because she wanted them to, but because justice had walked with her, and it had returned, satisfied. The wind followed behind her like a loyal friend. Adis stood at the heart of Yamun, a woman who had been shaped by the very earth she walked upon. Her transformation had come not only in her strength, but in her spirit, a flame that had been nurtured through years of hardship, rising from the ashes of violence and silence. Her feet, once broken and torn, were now symbols of resistance, healing, and justice. In the years that had passed since Okafor's exile, Adise had become more than a healer. She was the heart of the village, the force that had driven it to see beyond its fears, its traditions, and its silences. No longer just a woman who healed the sick, she had become the one who stood tall in the face of injustice, the one who could look any challenge in the eye and bring it to its knees. The village that had once turned a blind eye now turned to her for guidance, for wisdom, for strength. Where whispers had once surrounded her name in fear, now the elders spoke her story with reverence. She was the girl who couldn't walk, but who had risen, and in rising, had changed everything. Her limp, which had been the symbol of her suffering, was now a reminder to all who saw it. No matter how deep the wound, one could still stand. One could still fight. One could still rise. But it was not just her own victory that Adise celebrated. It was the transformation of those who had watched her struggle, those who had witnessed her journey and understood that the same strength was within them. The young girls of the village no longer feared silence or oppression. They no longer feared the weight of a patriarchal system that kept their voices muted and their bodies bound. They spoke, and their voices rang clear like a bell. They walked, heads high, feet strong beneath them, knowing that Adise had shown them that silence was never the answer, that their words, their actions, their very existence mattered. In the healing hut she had created, Adise placed her staff, Odiyu, beside her mother's calabash. It was a silent homage to both the woman who had birthed her and the woman who had helped her rise. The staff, carved with symbols of strength and resilience, now stood as a beacon to all who came to seek healing. It was not just a tool for curing ailments, but a reminder of the power that lay in standing tall, even when the world tried to break you. And as the years went on, the story of Adise was passed down, a story that would never be forgotten. Elders would gather the children around the fire, telling the tale of the girl who had been beaten until she could not walk, but who had, in the end, brought a monster to his knees. The story lived in the hearts of the people, carried on the lips of the old and the young, a story that gave the village a sense of purpose and unity. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the trees, Adise would walk with the children. Her limp was still there, but it no longer defined her. She walked with them through the village, telling them of the herbs that grew along the riverbanks, of the plants that could heal the most broken of hearts, and of the strength that lay within each of them. She taught them to look at the world with open eyes, to see the injustices that surrounded them, and to know that they, too, had the power to change things. And as they walked, Adise's voice would echo through the village, her words a gentle reminder of all she had endured and achieved. "He broke my body, but not my will," she would say, her feet steady and strong beneath her. These feet were not made for running, but for rising. Her words carried across the village like the sound of a drumbeat, reminding everyone that justice was not something that came from power or force, but from the strength of one's spirit. It was a lesson that Adise had learned the hard way, but it was a lesson she had passed on to everyone who had come to know her. In a land where silence had once reigned, where people had cowered beneath the weight of their fears, Adise had become the drumbeats of justice. Her footsteps were the rhythm that had shaken the very ground, awakening those who had long been dormant, inspiring them to rise alongside her. The legacy of Adise, the woman who had risen from the ashes, would live on. In the hearts of those she had touched, in the stories passed from one generation to the next, in the children who now walked with their heads held high, her footsteps would forever echo. And so, in the quiet moments when the village would listen closely, they would hear it, the sound of Adise's steps, steady and sure, as she walked beside the children she had saved, her feet never faltering, her spirit never broken.